So, there's a major Supreme Court decision that everyone needs to know about. The court just issued a unanimous 9-0 ruling involving the Fourth Amendment, specifically how it applies when law enforcement uses excessive force and how that force affects your constitutional rights. This isn't a small case. It's a significant ruling that's now making its way back through the lower courts, and the outcome could shape how similar cases are handled in the future. Before we get started, if you'd like to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply by subscribing. It really helps the channel grow and allows me to continue bringing you updates on important legal cases like this one. Now, this ruling comes from a case called Barnes versus Felix, and it's something everyone should be paying attention to. It centers around the Fourth Amendment's protection against unreasonable searches and seizures, and more importantly, how courts should determine when police use of force crosses the constitutional line. Although this case isn't directly about warrantless searches or firearms, it digs deep into what's known as the seizure doctrine. That means it examines when law enforcement actions, especially those involving force, become a violation of a person's rights under the Constitution. Now, this is particularly relevant to law-abiding gun owners and anyone concerned with civil liberties. We've seen too many cases where encounters between law enforcement and citizens escalate unnecessarily, sometimes leading to tragic results. The Supreme Court's interpretation in Barnes versus Felix is likely to influence how courts view those kinds of incidents going forward. The facts of the case are intense. The situation began when Officer Roberto Felix Jr., a law enforcement officer in Texas, pulled over Ashton Barnes for alleged toll violations. Barnes had been driving on a Texas freeway, and highway cameras flagged his vehicle for unpaid tolls. When Officer Felix initiated the stop, he ordered Barnes to step out of his vehicle. At first, Barnes appeared to comply. He opened the car door and looked as though he was about to get out. But then, in a sudden move, he tried to drive away. At that moment, Officer Felix made a split-second decision. As Barnes began to accelerate, the officer jumped onto the car's open doorframe, placing one foot on the floorboard while clinging to the side of the moving vehicle. Within seconds, Felix pulled out his firearm and fired 2 shots into the car, striking Barnes. Barnes was hit, but before losing control, he managed to bring the vehicle to a stop. Tragically, he died shortly after. The entire encounter, from the moment Barnes tried to flee to the final gunshot, unfolded in just a few seconds. Because of this incident, Ashton Barnes's parents filed a lawsuit against Officer Roberto Felix, claiming that the officer violated their son's Fourth Amendment rights by using excessive force during the encounter. When the case first reached the district court, the judge ruled in favor of Officer Felix. The court relied on something known as the moment of threat rule, which is used by the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. According to this rule, when evaluating whether an officer's use of deadly force is justified, the court only considers the exact moment when the officer perceived a threat. Anything that happened before or after that moment is considered irrelevant. The Fifth Circuit later affirmed that ruling. They explained that under the moment of threat doctrine, the only question is whether the officer was in danger at the precise moment deadly force was used. In this case, that moment was the 2 seconds when Officer Felix was clinging to the moving car as Barnes tried to flee. Because Felix could have reasonably believed that his life was in danger at that instant, the Fifth Circuit held that the shooting was lawful. But Barnes's family didn't stop there. They appealed the case all the way to the United States Supreme Court, which agreed to hear it. The question before the justices was critical. Should courts evaluate these types of Fourth Amendment cases using the moment of threat rule, or should they use a broader standard that takes everything into account? In a 9-0 unanimous decision, the Supreme Court rejected the Fifth Circuit's narrow approach. The court ruled that when someone alleges excessive force by law enforcement, the case must be analyzed under the Fourth Amendment's objective reasonableness standard. That means the question isn't what the officer personally believed in the heat of the moment, but what a reasonable officer in that same situation would have done. The court went further, emphasizing that this analysis must consider the totality of the circumstances, not just the split second before shots were fired. They stated that determining whether an officer's use of force is reasonable requires careful attention to all the facts surrounding the incident, including what led up to it. The justices made it clear that the moment of threat rule used by the Fifth Circuit does not align with the Constitution's requirements. They wrote that a rule which ignores everything that happened before the shooting cannot be reconciled with the fact-dependent and context-sensitive approach this court has long prescribed. In other words, courts can't put on blinders and pretend that only the final 2 seconds matter. However, the Supreme Court stopped short of deciding one key issue: whether an officer's own actions that create a dangerous situation should factor into the reasonableness analysis. They didn't rule on that question, leaving it for the lower courts to decide when the case returns for further review. The takeaway from this ruling is significant. The Supreme Court has rejected the limited moment of threat approach and replaced it with a broader, more balanced analysis. Going forward, courts must evaluate everything: what led up to the use of force, the officer's decisions before the confrontation, and what happened during the event itself. Justice Brett Kavanaugh, joined by Justices Clarence Thomas, Amy Coney Barrett, and Samuel Alito, wrote a concurring opinion to add further context. They stressed that traffic stops are inherently dangerous for law enforcement officers. Every year, many officers are injured or killed during these encounters. They also pointed out that when Barnes decided to drive away, it not only endangered the officer, but also posed a risk to the public. Still, the concurring justices agreed that the entire sequence of events must be considered by the lower courts. They cautioned that courts cannot simply focus on the few seconds when the officer was on the moving car and conclude the shooting was justified. Instead, they must evaluate all the circumstances leading up to the officer's decision to use deadly force: what the officer did, what Barnes did, and how the situation escalated. In short, the Supreme Court made it clear that excessive force cases are not about isolated moments. They're about the complete picture: every decision, every action, and every risk that led to the outcome. This ruling is now the guiding standard for how similar cases will be reviewed moving forward. In essence, the Supreme Court determined that courts must look beyond just the immediate moment of a perceived threat, and instead evaluate the totality of the circumstances surrounding an incident. Following that decision, the Supreme Court officially issued its mandate, sending the case back to the lower court for further proceedings. Right now, this case is moving forward once again at the district court level. Ashton Barnes's father, who is currently incarcerated, is representing his late son pro se, meaning without an attorney. He has already notified the district court about the Supreme Court's ruling and is working to set a new trial date. This time, the court will be required to examine every aspect of the incident, not just the few seconds in which the shooting took place. This case carries enormous significance because it reshapes how courts interpret Fourth Amendment protections against excessive force. It's not just about one tragic event, it sets a precedent that could affect countless others. For lawful gun owners, this decision is especially important. We've seen numerous incidents where responsible citizens have been harmed or even killed during tense encounters with law enforcement. These moments often unfold quickly and under unclear circumstances. The Supreme Court's ruling in Barnes v. Felix now ensures that when these cases reach the courts, judges can't simply focus on the instant when shots were fired. They must look at the entire sequence of events leading up to that moment. That change opens the door for more fair and balanced evaluations of use-of-force incidents, and potentially gives citizens a stronger legal standing in future cases. This ruling has also gained additional importance because the Supreme Court recently heard oral arguments in another major Fourth Amendment case, Case v. Montana. That case centers on law enforcement officers entering a home without a warrant, raising questions about privacy, search, and seizure protections. Interestingly, the Barnes v. Felix decision has already been referenced in that case's legal briefs and even mentioned during oral arguments. What that means is the reasoning behind Barnes v. Felix may soon influence other Supreme Court decisions, expanding its reach beyond just traffic stops or excessive force situations. It's possible that this ruling could shape how courts handle future cases involving police encounters, warrantless searches, and broader questions of constitutional rights. So, while the Barnes case continues at the district court level, its ripple effects are already being felt nationwide. As these developments unfold, we'll be watching closely to see how the courts interpret and apply this new standard. As always, I'll keep you updated as new information becomes available and as the case progresses. If you found this explanation helpful and want to support the channel, the best way to do that is by subscribing and turning on notifications so you don't miss future updates. Thank you all so much for your continued support. Stay informed, stay safe, and remember, knowing your rights is the first step to protecting them.